We came to measure the human mind, but the first thing we found was a human heart working past its limit. The station alarm had a way of getting into Ethan Carter's teeth. It rose through the metal deck in a thin electric whine, rattling the loose bolts in the service grates and the half-dead coffee in his stomach, while red emergency strobes swept across Orbital Transit 9 in slow, patient pulses. The air smelled like overheated wiring, sanitizer, and coolant mist, the familiar perfume of a place that held together mostly because tired people refused to let it fall apart. Ethan knelt in a shallow spill of icy fluid outside gate C-12 with a thermal patch clamped in one hand and a diagnostic wand in the other, trying to coax an old heating unit back to life before the waiting area turned into a refrigerator. The screen on the wall kept flashing delayed in 6 languages. Somewhere down the corridor, a child cried with the exhausted rhythm of someone too worn out to be dramatic about it anymore. Ethan pulled off one glove with his teeth, reached into the access panel, and tightened a scorched coupler with 2 numb fingers. The unit shuddered, coughed, then finally gave a low mechanical hum. Warm air spilled from the vent. A few people in the waiting area lifted their heads without even knowing who had fixed it. That was usually how his best work went. He stood, rolled the ache from his shoulders, and turned just in time to see the little girl. She could not have been more than 7 or 8 by Earth standards, a small blue-skinned child tucked behind a cracked luggage bin with her knees pulled to her chest and a silver transit tag hanging crooked from one wrist. Her guardian was nowhere in sight. Her coat was too thin for this side of the station, and every breath she took came out as a tiny tremble. Ethan looked once toward Central Security, where 3 officers were busy arguing over a custom scanner, then back at the girl. He already knew what the handbook said. Unaccompanied minors were supposed to be reported, logged, processed, transferred. He also knew what cold felt like when it got into your bones. He crouched in front of her slowly, lowering himself until his voice did not have to travel far. "Hey," he said, keeping it gentle. "Your ride lose track of you." The girl looked up with huge, frightened eyes that reflected the red strobe like glass catching firelight, but she said nothing. Ethan slipped off the insulated overshirt tied around his waist and draped it over her shoulders. The fabric nearly swallowed her whole. For a second she just stared, as if the idea of warmth offered without negotiation did not fit into anything she had been taught. Across the concourse, behind the glass wall of the observation mezzanine, Dr. Lyra Vane watched the exchange without blinking. Her slate-gray data tablet glowed against her turquoise skin as lines of translated notation scrolled past her elegant fingers. She had arrived 3 hours earlier with the Valen Cultural Survey team, one of 6 researchers sent to study humanity in its uncontrolled environment. Earth had insisted on calling the visit friendly. Lyra preferred accurate. She had expected noise, impatience, territorial behavior, mild dishonesty, perhaps a little vanity. Humans had a reputation for all of it. What she had not expected was this maintenance worker with oil on his sleeves giving up a layer of warmth to a stranger no one else had even noticed. "Subject displays inefficient protective redistribution," she murmured into her recorder, though the words sounded thinner than they had in her head. Ethan never saw her. He was already standing again, rubbing his bare forearms against the station chill, then crossing the corridor toward an elderly passenger whose cane had slid out of reach. Lyra lifted her eyes from the tablet and followed him with a level of attention she had not intended to give any one human. Somewhere beneath the alarm and the station hum, a new question opened inside her like a door unsealing. Maybe they had not come to study the right thing after all. Dr. Lyra Vane had crossed 3 mapped sectors to observe humanity, and in less than 10 minutes on Orbital Transit 9, one maintenance medic with tired eyes had already made her notes feel incomplete. She remained behind the observation glass while the station breathed and shuddered around her, every surface washed in rotating red light that turned polished metal into something raw and feverish. Beyond the mezzanine, the transit concourse stretched in long industrial lines of carbon-gray flooring, fogged glass, and humming service rails, crowded with travelers wrapped in blankets, uniforms, robes, and pressure capes from a dozen different worlds. The official briefing had described humans as adaptive, ambitious, and emotionally erratic under stress. It had said nothing about the quiet way they kept reaching for one another in the middle of inconvenience. Lyra lowered her tablet for the first time since docking. Beneath her, Ethan Carter had already moved on from the child in the oversized overshirt. He was kneeling beside an elderly passenger now, retrieving a dropped cane from under a row of seats while balancing a toolbox against one leg. The older man was not human. Lyra recognized the folded cartilage around his ears and the silvery ridges along his temples. A Dracian, probably from the inner trade lanes, old enough that every movement looked negotiated rather than chosen. Ethan placed the cane back into the man's hands, said something too soft for the mezzanine microphones to catch, then adjusted the portable heat vent so the warm air would reach both the old man and the blue-skinned child without calling attention to either. It was a tiny recalibration. A waste of labor, by Valen efficiency models. A perfect solution, by any standard that counted discomfort as real. "You are assigning too much weight to isolated behavior," said a voice beside her. Supervisor Tauren, senior lead of the survey team, folded his long pale hands behind his back and looked through the glass with clinical detachment. His expression did not change, which for his species usually meant mild disapproval. Compassionate gestures are common in developing civilizations. It is often reputation management. Lyra kept her eyes on Ethan. No one is watching him closely enough for reputation to matter. Tauren's gaze shifted to her. "You are." She did not answer. Down below, a station manager in a charcoal service coat had intercepted Ethan near the heating control node. Even from the mezzanine, Lyra could see the exchange in posture alone. The manager's shoulders were stiff with practiced annoyance. Ethan stood still, one hand resting on the handle of his diagnostic case, taking the reprimand without defending himself. The manager pointed toward a wall terminal, then toward the waiting area, likely citing unauthorized use of thermal resources. Ethan glanced once at the shivering travelers he had warned, then nodded and keyed his badge against the terminal as if accepting a penalty that no one else in the concourse would ever notice. Lyra felt something unexpectedly sharp move through her chest. "There," Tauren said quietly. "A social cost. Now we will see whether the behavior persists." Ethan picked up his case, rolled his sleeve back down over his forearm, and walked away from the terminal with slower steps than before. For a brief moment Lyra thought the lesson had landed, that discomfort had finally taught him the proper mathematics of self-preservation. Then the crying started again near gate C-12, thin and frightened and trying very hard to be brave. Ethan changed direction without hesitation. He did not even look up at the cameras. Lyra watched him go, and for the first time since joining the Survey Corps, she found herself more interested in one unanswered human choice than in an entire archive of clean conclusions. The crying came from the narrow service corridor just past gate C-12, where the polished public-facing station ended and the real machinery began. Ethan followed it through the hum of ventilation fans and the faint metallic hiss of pressure seals cycling somewhere deeper in the wall. The air back there was colder by a good 10 degrees, maybe more, and it carried the dry taste of dust shaken loose from old ductwork. He found the little girl curled beside a stack of cargo foam panels, her borrowed overshirt trailing around her like a blanket that had forgotten how to be clothing. Up close, she looked even smaller than she had from the concourse, all trembling shoulders and wide eyes and the kind of silence children learned when they had already asked for help too many times. Ethan set his diagnostic case down slowly so the clasps would not snap loud enough to startle her. "All right," he said, lowering himself to one knee again. "Let us try this one piece at a time. Do you know your name?" Her lips parted. For a second he thought the answer would not come, but then it arrived in a whisper so thin he almost missed it. "Selly." "Okay, Selly." He gave her a small nod, like they were two adults making a practical arrangement instead of one overworked station medic improvising with a frightened child in a drafty corridor. "I am Ethan. We have got warmth covered for the moment. Next thing is figuring out where your people are." He reached for the transit tag at her wrist and turned it toward the corridor light. The display flickered, then died entirely. Of course it did. Half the station was running on repairs held together by stubbornness and adhesive tape. Ethan exhaled through his nose and tapped the casing with one finger. That would be too easy. Sally looked at him as though waiting for that small mechanical failure to become anger. When it did not, some of the tightness left her face. Ethan dug into his case, moved aside cable ties, med patches, and a coil of sensor wire, then came up with a compact utility lamp and clipped it to the open lid. Warm amber light pushed back the hard white glare of the corridor and made the little pocket of space feel less like a place people forgot things. There, he said. Better than station lighting, right? Sally gave the faintest nod. From the open concourse behind them came the sound of rolling luggage, overhead announcements, and the endless station murmur of tired people going somewhere they wished they had already reached. Ethan scanned the girl for injury by habit more than procedure. Her pupils reacted evenly. No bruising. No labored breathing. Just cold, fear, and exhaustion. The last one he understood better than he liked. I am going to run a manual search on your tag, he said. It might take a minute. You stay right here and keep stealing all my body heat with that shirt. The joke was terrible, but it earned him something close to a confused almost smile. He had just reached for the portable scanner when he sensed movement at the corridor entrance. Not security. Too still for that. Ethan looked up and found a tall figure framed by the red spill of the emergency lights, turquoise skin catching the glow in shifting shades of sea glass and stormwater. Dr. Lyra Vane stepped forward with the measured grace of someone used to being watched and listened to, though her expression held more uncertainty than authority now. Her tablet was tucked against one arm, forgotten for once. The child is registered through docking manifold 4, she said. Her voice was low, precise, and somehow softer than he expected. Her guardian signal did not vanish. It moved. Ethan rose partway, one hand still on the case. You tracked her? Lyra met his gaze. I observed a problem, she said, then after the smallest pause, and chose not to remain theoretical about it. For one suspended heartbeat, with the corridor lights humming and the child wrapped in his shirt and the station groaning around them like some giant machine too old to hide its age, Ethan simply looked at her. Then he gave a tired, genuine smile that caught Lyra more off guard than any alarm on the station ever could. Good, he said. Then maybe you can help me bring her home. Ethan had met plenty of people who sounded calm because they were trained to be calm, but Dr. Lyra Vane sounded different. Her voice carried the careful balance of someone discovering that facts could change shape when they were forced to stand beside real suffering. He closed the latches on his diagnostic case, then looked from Lyra to Sally and back again, already building a route through the station in his head. Docking manifold 4 sat nearly half a mile from gate C-12, past 2 customs corridors, 1 freight bypass, and a moving sidewalk that had been out of service since last winter. Under ideal conditions it was a 10-minute walk. On Orbital Transit 9, ideal conditions were usually a rumor. Ethan held out a hand to Sally. You up for a field trip? The little girl stared at him for a second, then slipped her small blue fingers into his gloveless hand. Her skin was cool as polished stone. Lyra watched that simple gesture with a focus intense enough to feel almost like heat. The guardian signal belongs to an adult female, she said as they stepped back into the concourse. Species designation Marin. Temporary merchant visa. Elevated stress markers detected 14 minutes ago. Ethan glanced sideways at her while guiding Sally around a luggage cart. You can read stress markers from a transit tag. Valen survey instruments are not built around guesswork. That must be nice. The corner of Lyra's mouth shifted, almost a reaction, almost not. They moved through the crowd in a current of station noise and stale warmth. Overhead, the public address system repeated boarding delays in a voice so cheerful it felt insulting. Travelers huddled under heat vents or argued quietly with service kiosks that could not do anything except apologize in 12 languages. A human woman in a shipping uniform knelt to tie her son's bootlace while still talking into a headset. A broad-shouldered cargo loader paused to lift a stranger's bag onto a bench without being asked. Lyra's gaze kept moving to these little collisions of effort and kindness as if she had suddenly developed an ear for a frequency she had spent years filtering out. "Your people do this often," she said at last. Ethan looked over. "Do what?" "Interrupt their own tasks for one another." He adjusted the strap of his case against his shoulder. "Not always. Not enough. But sometimes enough to matter." Selly stayed close at his side, wrapped in his oversized overshirt, her transit tag tapping lightly against her wrist with every step. When they reached the access ramp to the lower manifold, they found the escalator dead and the stairs crowded with travelers dragging cases up by hand. Ethan did not think twice. He scooped Selly up with an apologetic grunt and started down the metal steps, boots ringing softly on the grated treads. She stiffened at first, surprised, then relaxed against his shoulder with the trust children gave only after deciding you were safe. Lyra descended beside him in a measured sweep of turquoise and silver, one hand trailing the rail. "You expend a great deal of energy on others," she said. Ethan let out a breath that might have been a laugh. "Lady, I work maintenance on a station held together by caffeine and deferred repairs. Energy is all anybody expends around here." This time Lyra did smile, small and startled and very real. At the bottom of the stairs, docking manifold 4 opened before them in a cavern of steel arches, cargo lights, and docking clamps thick as bridge cables. The air smelled like hydraulic fluid, ozone, and the distant clean bite of vacuum kept on the other side of reinforced doors. Near Customs Bay 7, a woman with pale sea-green skin was speaking rapidly to a station officer, hands trembling as she clutched a folded child's blanket to her chest. Even from across the floor Ethan recognized the posture immediately. Not anger. Not impatience. Fear stretched so tight it had forgotten how to breathe. Selly made a tiny sound in his arms, a sound too relieved to become a word. Ethan felt her grip tighten on his shoulder. Beside him, Lyra lowered her tablet without taking a single note. The moment the woman saw Selly in Ethan's arms, the whole docking bay seemed to narrow around. One simple human truth Lyra had not been trained to measure. The Marin mother made a sound that was half breath, half prayer, and then she was moving, not with the polished restraint of a merchant in a public terminal, but with the helpless speed of someone whose fear had finally found an ending. Ethan lowered Selly before the woman reached them, and the little girl ran the last few steps on her own. Her mother dropped to her knees on the steel deck and gathered her into both arms with such force that the child disappeared inside the folds of her travel shawl and the blanket still clutched in her trembling hand. For a few seconds neither of them spoke clearly. Their words came out broken by relief, soft and fast and too intimate for translation to matter. Ethan stepped back without ceremony, giving them room as naturally as if he had rehearsed that distance his whole life. The station officer near Customs Bay 7 looked from the reunited pair to Ethan's maintenance badge and then to Lyra's survey insignia, clearly trying to assemble a version of events that fit procedure. Was this a custody error, he asked, hand hovering over his terminal. Ethan shook his head. No error. Just a kid getting lost on a bad day. The officer frowned at the overshirt draped around Selly's shoulders and the dead transit tag hanging from her wrist. You should have logged the find through proper family recovery channels. Ethan's mouth twitched with tired amusement. Then she would still be crying in a cold corridor while 3 departments argued about the form. Before the officer could answer, the mother rose, one hand still wrapped around Selly's shoulder as if she did not fully trust the universe not to steal her back. She bowed first to Ethan, then to Lyra, and the motion was formal enough to turn nearby heads. I am Noreen Soul, she said, voice unsteady but clear. My daughter wandered when the heating alarms triggered and the crowd shifted. I lost visual contact for 6 minutes. She looked at Ethan the way people looked at doors held open during storms, as if they had almost forgotten such things existed. 6 minutes can become a lifetime when it is your child. Thank you. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck, suddenly looking more uncomfortable with gratitude than he ever had with alarms. She did most of the hard part. I just walked her over. Noreen's eyes shone in the hard docking lights. No. You noticed. The words settled over the bay more quietly than any announcement from the station speakers. Lyra felt them land somewhere deep, in that place beyond theory where truth stopped being elegant and started being undeniable. You noticed. Not conquered, not studied, not optimized. Noticed. The officer glanced away first, embarrassed by something he could not input into a terminal. Around them, life on the station resumed its restless motion. Cargo drones hummed past on magnet rails. A departure alert flashed amber over Bay 9. Somewhere far above, the public address system announced another delay in its falsely cheerful voice. Yet for one suspended moment the noise felt like background to a much older thing, one person seeing another's distress and deciding it mattered. Noreen reached into the inner fold of her shawl and drew out a small square token of polished shell and copper wire, the kind of travel charm merchants carried from home ports. She offered it to Ethan with both hands. Please. A family blessing for safe roads. Ethan hesitated, then accepted it with a gentleness Lyra had come to recognize as the signature of his character. He did not treat small things as small when they had come from someone's heart. Thank you, he said quietly. Sally looked up at him from under the overshirt, then tugged at one sleeve and gave it back with great solemnity, as if returning a uniform after borrowing bravery. Ethan smiled and crouched to take it. Lyra watched his face soften, watched the mother hold her child, watched the officer stand a little less rigidly than before, and realized with a strange, almost painful clarity that compassion was not interrupting the functioning of the station. In some invisible way, it was the only reason the place functioned at all. When Ethan and Lyra left docking manifold 4, the station had settled into that uneasy middle state between crisis and routine, where the alarms were quieter but nobody trusted the silence yet. The red emergency strobes had given way to amber service lights along the main corridor, washing the metal walls in a tired gold that made every dent and patch plate look older than it had an hour ago. Ethan folded the borrowed warmth of the moment away just as he folded his overshirt over one arm, then checked the time on his wrist display and let out a low breath through his nose. He was already late for 3 maintenance calls and 1 official reprimand. You do realize, he said as they stepped onto the long East Concourse, that I am probably making very poor career choices in front of an interstellar research delegation. Lyra walked beside him with her tablet dark at her side for once, no longer using it as a shield between herself and the world. I am beginning to suspect your career and your character are in ongoing disagreement. Ethan glanced at her, surprised into a short laugh. That might be the most accurate thing anybody has said to me all month. The corridor ahead was crowded with stranded passengers, station staff, and rolling service carts that beeped apologetically as they threaded through the human tide. Somewhere above them a ventilation fan clicked on and off with the rhythm of a bad bearing. Ethan heard it immediately and angled his head up. Great, he muttered. Deck 12 air handling is going to fail before sunrise. Lyra followed his gaze. You can identify a damaged component by sound alone. After 7 years in this place, the station complains to me personally. They reached a narrow supply alcove where a young food vendor was trying to lift a jammed thermal shutter over her kiosk. Steam from industrial soup canisters curled into the corridor, carrying the comforting smell of broth, pepper, and synthetic yeast bread. Without slowing much, Ethan set down his case, wedged a shoulder under the warped edge of the shutter, and gave it a hard upward shove. The mechanism rattled, resisted, then finally rose the rest of the way with a relieved metallic clatter. The vendor blinked at him. I did not even file a request yet. Ethan retrieved his case. Then I am ahead of the paperwork for once. She laughed, pressed a heat cup into his free hand before he could refuse, and did the same for Lyra after only the briefest hesitation. For the save, she said. Ethan gave a grateful nod. Lyra accepted the cup with both hands, clearly unfamiliar with hot food being offered outside a formal setting. The heat ghosted across her turquoise skin in pale silver reflections. She took one careful sip and went very still. "This is surprisingly good." "That is because you expected it to be terrible," Ethan said. "I expected it to be efficient," Lyra replied, and the dryness of it made him smile again. They moved on more slowly after that, drinking as they walked. Through the broad observation windows to their right, Earth hung below the station in a sweep of blue, white, and nightside gold, so beautiful it made the hard lines of the concourse seem temporary by comparison. Lyra stopped without warning. Ethan took 2 extra steps before noticing and turning back. She was looking down at the planet with an expression he had not seen on her before, not cold, not analytical, but almost unguarded. "What is it?" he asked. Lyra remained still for a moment, fingers curled around the warm cup. "Our briefing materials described humans as expansion-driven," she said softly. "Aggressively curious. Socially unstable. Quick to divide themselves." Ethan leaned one shoulder against the window frame. "That all sounds uncomfortably familiar, actually." "Yes," she said. "And yet no report explained this." She turned from the glass to the corridor, to the vendor handing out extra napkins to tired travelers, to a porter lifting someone else's case, to a mother sharing the last of her drink with a stranger's child, to Ethan standing there with coolant stains on his sleeves and a shell and copper travel charm tucked awkwardly into one pocket as if he still did not quite know what to do with gratitude. "Explained what?" he asked. Lyra looked at him with quiet seriousness, as if the answer mattered more than any statistic she had ever logged. "Why your species keeps choosing one another, even when it is inconvenient." Ethan held her gaze for a second, then looked out at Earth again, that bright impossible world floating in black silence. "Maybe because convenience is a lousy reason to build a life," he said. Lyra said nothing after that, but she walked beside him when he turned toward his next repair call, and this time it no longer felt like observation. It felt like the beginning of understanding. By the time Ethan reached Deck 12, the station had slipped into the gray hour that only existed in places with no real sunrise, when people stopped looking fresh enough to pretend they were fine and started moving on habit alone. The access corridor narrowed into a service spine lined with exposed conduit, maintenance hatches, and old pipes that sweated condensation into the chill. Every few yards, amber status strips flickered against brushed steel, painting tired bands of light across Ethan's face as he walked. Lyra stayed with him without asking permission this time. Her steps were soundless beside his heavier boots, her reflection gliding in fractured pieces across the polished utility panels. Ethan keyed open the Deck 12 ventilation junction and a wave of dry heated air pushed out, carrying the smell of dust, machine oil, and a faint electrical tang that told him the failing fan motor had started to scorch. "There it is," he murmured, kneeling in front of the maintenance housing. "Station is trying to cook its own bearings again." He set down his case, pulled a compact driver and sensor probe from the foam insert, and went to work with the steady concentration of someone who had long ago accepted that keeping a place alive was mostly made of unglamorous decisions repeated on time. Lyra stood close enough to feel the heat rolling from the open panel. "You speak of this structure as if it were a living organism." Ethan loosened a warped plate and reached into the housing. "At 3 in the morning, everything starts sounding alive." He withdrew the damaged bearing assembly and held it up under the utility lamp clipped to his case. The metal ring had gone dark at the edges from friction. "See that? It starts as a noise nobody wants to chase. Then a vent fails. Then a waiting area gets cold. Then a kid wanders because her mother is distracted trying to keep her warm. Little failures do not stay little for long." Lyra looked at the bearing, then at him, and something in her expression sharpened with recognition. He was not only repairing hardware. He was describing people. Before she could answer, a hiss of frustration came from farther down the corridor. A station janitor in faded green coveralls was trying to maneuver a supply cart around a jammed wheel while balancing a stack of sanitation packs against one hip. Without even looking up from the fan housing, Ethan called, "Lock pin is bent on the left caster." The janitor stopped, crouched, checked the wheel, and barked out a laugh. "You are kidding. I wish." Ethan nodded toward his open case. Flat wrench. Second. Tray. Lyra watched the janitor hesitate, clearly unsure whether to dig through someone else's tools. Then, with the easy boldness of the overtired, she reached into Ethan's kit, found the wrench, and handed it over before the woman could ask. The janitor blinked at her survey insignia, then took it carefully. "Thank you, ma'am." "I did not repair anything," Lyra said. "You reduced delay," Ethan replied, fitting the replacement bearing into place. "Around here that counts." A few minutes later the cart rolled cleanly, the janitor headed off with a grateful wave, and the ventilation unit came back to life with a low clean hum that sounded almost content. Warm air moved through the corridor in a steady stream, pushing the cold back inch by inch. Ethan sat back on his heels and wiped his hands on a rag. There. One crisis downgraded to annoyance. Lyra should have recorded the repair, the social interaction, the observed exchange of assistance between unrelated workers. Instead she found herself watching the effects ripple outward. A nurse at the far junction smiled when the airflow returned and stopped rubbing her arms. A courier waiting by the wall lifted his face toward the vent with visible relief. Two maintenance apprentices carrying filter packs straightened as if the warmth had reached deeper than skin. The station shifted, subtly but undeniably, because one man had listened when a machine complained. "You were right," Lyra said quietly. Ethan looked up. "About what?" Her gaze moved from the restored vent to the empty corridor where the janitor had gone, then to the warm air touching strangers who would never know his name. Little failures do not stay little. Ethan studied her for a moment, then gave a small nod, as if he understood she was no longer talking about machinery alone. Somewhere beyond the bulkhead, the station kept humming, old and overworked and held together by more than bolts. For the first time since arriving, Lyra began to suspect compassion might not be an exception in human systems. It might be the hidden infrastructure. Lyra had spent years learning how to observe without participating, how to stand at the edge of another species and extract pattern without ever letting feeling contaminate the data. On Orbital Transit 9, that discipline began to fail somewhere between a repaired vent, a shared cup of soup, and a human maintenance medic who treated inconvenience as if it were simply another word for duty. Ethan rose from the ventilation housing with a quiet groan and snapped the latches on his tool case shut. "Come on," he said, rolling stiffness from one shoulder. "If I stay still too long, the station starts assuming I am decorative." Lyra fell into step beside him again as they moved deeper through Deck 12, past supply lockers, emergency med stations, and a long row of narrow observation windows showing only darkness and distant docking lights. The hour had thinned the crowds but not the work. A nurse in pale blue scrubs leaned against a wall terminal, rubbing tired circles at the base of her neck while reviewing patient transfers. Down the hall, two cargo handlers redistributed crates by hand because a lift platform had stalled. A teenage boy in an apprentice badge was helping an elderly traveler reseal a stubborn pressure collar with hands that shook from fatigue but did not stop. None of it matched the clean Valen assumption that social systems function through formal roles alone. Here, responsibility seemed to leak across boundaries the way heat leaked from damaged conduits, wasted by the equations, necessary in practice. Ethan stopped at an auxiliary junction to reset a flickering panel, then glanced over his shoulder when Lyra did not answer some half-formed comment he had made about old wiring. She was looking past him into a waiting alcove just off the corridor. Inside, a human woman in a maintenance vest was dividing the contents of her lunch tin between herself and a courier she clearly did not know, sliding him the larger half when she thought he was not looking. Across from them, a broad-shouldered station guard had taken off one glove to help a child from another world thread tiny fingers through a snapped backpack clasp. No one was performing kindness for an audience. They were simply doing it, with the absent-minded regularity of people tightening loose bolts in a wall they all depended on. "You see it now," Ethan said quietly. Lyra turned to him. "It is not you." He gave her a tired smile. "That sounds almost insulting." "I mean," she said, then paused, adjusting the words as if precision mattered more than pride, you are not an anomaly. Ethan leaned against the reset panel and folded his arms. No. I am just easier to study. Because I keep ending up in front of you. Lyra looked back into the alcove, where the courier was trying and failing not to look grateful. Our models predicted competition under strain, she said. Resource guarding. Increased self-prioritization. Social contraction. We do that too, Ethan said. We are human, not saints. His voice stayed even, but there was no defensiveness in it, only honesty worn smooth by repetition. But that is not all we do. Something in the corridor lighting shifted as power routed to a neighboring sector, and for a moment the station dimmed into bronze shadow before the strips brightened again. In that brief hush between electrical states, Lyra understood what had been wrong with the Valen approach from the beginning. They had come to measure what humans achieved under pressure. They had not thought to measure what humans carried for one another while doing it. Her wrist comm chimed then, sharp and official. Supervisor Talron's identifier flashed across the screen. Lyra accepted the call. His image resolved in cool blue light above the comm, features composed, voice precise. Dr. Vane, preliminary synthesis begins in 2 hours. Return to the survey suite and prepare your findings. Command wishes an early read on whether humanity demonstrates the emotional stability required for broader cultural access. The call ended before she answered. Lyra lowered her wrist slowly. Ethan had gone still. That sounds important, he said. She met his eyes. Beyond him, the nurse had straightened and gone back to work, the guard had fixed the child's bag, and the maintenance woman had finished sharing her meal without expecting thanks. The station kept breathing through old metal and warm hands. It is, Lyra said. Because if they ask the wrong question, they will never understand the right answer. They walked the rest of Deck 12 in a silence that did not feel empty so much as full of things neither of them had learned how to name yet. Ethan carried his tool case in one hand and the weight of Lyra's last sentence in the other, turning it over in his mind like a piece of hardware that looked simple until you realized the whole system depended on it. If her people were deciding whether humanity deserved broader access, then somewhere in a polished room with controlled lighting and perfect air, strangers were getting ready to reduce everything he had shown her to categories. Stable. Unstable. Useful. Risky. Worthy. Unworthy. The thought left a metallic taste in the back of his throat. They reached a junction where the corridor opened into a broad maintenance crossway overlooking one of the station's central transit halls. Below them, the station kept living at its usual stubborn pace. A line cook from the night galley carried a tray of untouched rolls to a bench where delayed passengers had fallen asleep sitting up. A technician with grease on both sleeves stopped to retighten the wheel lock on a stranger's chair without breaking stride. Near a shuttered kiosk, an exhausted customs clerk quietly handed her own station-issued blanket to an alien grandmother whose hands would not stop shaking from the cold. Lyra stood at the rail and watched each of these small acts with a stillness Ethan had learned to read as concentration so deep it bordered on reverence. If they deny cultural access, she said at last, it will not be because your people lack intelligence or capacity. It will be because my superiors believe humans are too emotionally volatile to be trusted with deeper exchange. Ethan rested his forearms on the rail beside her. And what do you believe? Lyra did not answer immediately. Light from the transit hall rose in shifting amber bands across her turquoise skin, softening the hard analytical lines she had worn when they first met. I believe volatility is not the same thing as weakness, she said. I believe there are forms of strength my models were never designed to detect. Ethan stared down at the sleeping travelers and overworked staff and all the little unnoticed kindnesses moving through the station like current through hidden wire. Good, he said quietly. Because if somebody judges us only by our worst moments, they are going to miss the whole species. That made her turn toward him. Do you know how rare that sentence is? He gave her a tired half-smile. On Earth? Not rare enough. In committee reports, maybe. The corner of her mouth moved again, that almost smile he was beginning to think mattered because it never came cheaply. Then her expression shifted, sharpened by thought. "Come with me," she said. Ethan blinked. "To the survey suite?" "Yes. I am a maintenance medic in coolant-stained work pants. You are also the clearest argument I have." He looked down at his sleeves. At the old burn mark near one cuff and the fresh dust on his knees from the vent housing, and let out a breath that might have been disbelief. "That is an alarming sentence." "It is an accurate one." They started toward the central lift banks, Lyra moving with sudden purpose now, Ethan keeping pace half a step behind while service drones glided past them on silent magnetic tracks. The station lights reflected in the polished floor in long golden smears, and somewhere far above, beyond decks of steel and glass and exhausted people trying to get home, space pressed cold and patient against the hull. At the lift, a young human apprentice nearly collided with them while carrying an armful of replacement filters taller than his chest. Two of the filters slipped. Ethan caught one. Lyra caught the other. The apprentice flushed with embarrassment and thanked them both at once. After he hurried off, Ethan glanced sideways at her. "You keep doing that." "Doing what?" "Interrupting your own tasks for other people." Lyra looked ahead as the lift doors opened with a soft hydraulic sigh. "I am beginning to suspect it is contagious." Ethan laughed then, low and real, and for one brief moment the corridor felt lighter than the hour allowed. But as they stepped into the lift, the lights overhead flickered once, twice, and held just a fraction too long before stabilizing. Ethan's smile faded. He tilted his head, listening to something inside the station that most people would never hear. "That," he murmured, "is not good." The lift had barely started moving when Ethan set his tool case down and pressed two fingers against the brushed steel wall as if he could feel the station's pulse through the metal. The overhead lights flickered again, not the harmless stutter of an aging ballast this time, but a deeper shiver that ran through the entire car from floor grate to ceiling panel. Lyra felt it too, a low vibration beneath her boots, almost below hearing, like a giant machine clearing its throat before saying something nobody wanted to hear. Ethan's face changed first. All the dry humor went out of it at once. "That is not a local fault," he said. "That is a grid handoff failing somewhere it absolutely should not fail." Before Lyra could answer, the lift stopped between decks with a soft but final jolt. The ventilation fans cut out. For half a second the silence inside the car felt unnatural, stripped clean of the station's usual hum, and then backup power slammed in with a muted thump. Red emergency lighting flooded the small compartment, painting Ethan's skin in copper shadow and turning Lyra's turquoise into something darker, almost storm-colored. A station-wide alert cracked through the speaker above them, voice distorted by static. "Attention all personnel and travelers. Temporary power instability detected in core distribution sectors. Please remain calm and await routing instructions." Ethan stared up at the speaker with the expression of a man listening to a lie told for the sake of order. "Temporary," he muttered. "Sure." He was already on one knee with the maintenance panel open before the announcement repeated. His fingers moved fast and sure through a clutter of service ports and emergency bypass lines, the compact lamp from his kit clamped between his shoulder and jaw. Lyra crouched across from him, watching amber diagnostics ripple over the inside of the panel. "Can you restore the lift?" she asked. "Maybe. But that is not the real problem." He snapped a probe into place. "If the core distribution sectors are cascading, then doors, heat, life support balancing, med rails, all of it starts failing in pieces. Little failures do not stay little, remember." The words landed harder now. As if to prove him right, the calm on Lyra's wrist lit with overlapping priority signals. "Survey team recall. Command advisory. Structural notice." Then another alert hit the speaker, cleaner this time and infinitely worse in its calm. "Impact advisory. Orbital debris field has intersected outer traffic perimeter. Multiple non-critical hull contacts reported. Transit operations suspended. Civilian sectors may experience compartment isolation. Lyra looked up sharply. Debris field? Ethan swore under his breath, not loudly, just with the exhausted precision of someone whose bad feeling had been confirmed by machinery. Micrometeor fragments, most likely. Tiny pieces, big consequences. He glanced at her. This station can handle space. What it struggles with is 10,000 people panicking before the station has time to remember how. The lift shuddered again, harder this time, and from somewhere beyond the sealed doors came the distant metallic boom of emergency bulkheads locking down deck by deck. Not close. Not yet. But moving. Lyra felt the sound in her ribs. Her survey suite was 6 levels above them in a hardened research sector with dedicated power, private sheltering, and direct comms to command. Ethan, she realized with cold clarity, was thinking about none of that. He was listening past the lift walls, mapping the danger by instinct and experience, already locating where frightened strangers would need help long before official instructions caught up. When this door opens, he said, voice low and steady, people are going to need direction more than information. That is how bad systems work. They fail faster than explanations travel. Lyra's recall signal pulsed again, bright and insistent against her wrist. Return immediately. Survey personnel only. Ethan forced the bypass, and the lift gave a strained mechanical groan before descending the last few feet and unlocking with a hydraulic hiss. The corridor outside was lit entirely in red now. Travelers were already gathering in uncertain clusters. Somewhere a child was crying. Somewhere else, an elderly voice was asking a question no one had answered yet. Ethan grabbed his case and stepped toward the open doors. Lyra should have turned the other way. Instead she followed him into the failing light. The corridor outside the lift had changed in less than a minute from tired inconvenience to something more fragile and far more dangerous, uncertainty with too many bodies inside it. Red emergency strips ran along the floor in pulsing bands, turning luggage wheels, boots, and bare ankles into broken fragments of shadow as travelers crowded near the sealed junction ahead. The air had gone noticeably colder. Not life-threatening yet, but enough that people could feel the station losing control of its own comfort. Ethan moved into the middle of it with the same unremarkable certainty he used to crawl into access ducts and fix damaged vents, as if human panic were just another system that needed stabilization before it cascaded. Everybody listen to me, he called, not shouting, just pitching his voice in that flat practical register people trusted because it sounded like work. The station is in compartment mode. That means some doors are going to lock while power reroutes. It does not mean the whole place is coming apart. Stay off the lift shafts, keep the center path clear, and if you have heat blankets, share them forward to the kids and elders first. There was a strange thing about calm when it came from someone who clearly had no authority to fake it. People obeyed. A human father with a sleeping toddler shifted aside and opened space near the wall. A tall merchant from the inner lanes took off his insulated outer wrap and passed it toward an elderly couple without waiting to be asked. The station guard nearest the junction straightened from confusion into usefulness and began guiding foot traffic into 2 orderly lines. Lyra stood just behind Ethan, watching the ripple spread outward from him, not through command codes or status badges, but through trust earned in seconds. Her wrist comm flashed again with the survey recall signal. Return immediately. Priority shelter access. Research personnel only. She silenced it without answering. Ethan had already dropped to one knee beside a service terminal half buried by frightened travelers. He keyed in his maintenance clearance, jaw set, eyes moving fast over a cascade of deck maps and failing subsystem indicators. What do you need? Lyra asked. He did not look up. A route that keeps us away from the jammed choke points and gets medical priority passengers to heated shelter before the next power dip. Lyra stepped to the terminal's side input and opened an access window with her survey credentials. Ethan glanced at her hands, then at the Valen override string populating across the screen. You can do that? Apparently I can do many things my briefing did not prepare me for. Together they pulled schematics, thermal maps, and seal statuses into one workable picture. The central concourse was becoming a trap of stalled crowds. But a maintenance bypass ran behind the freight spine and opened into a sheltered clinic waiting bay less than 400 yards away. Ethan pointed. There. We moved the vulnerable first. He rose and turned back to the corridor, and before Lyra could say anything, a nurse in pale blue scrubs stepped forward from the crowd. Tell me where you want triage, she said. A cargo handler lifted one hand. I can carry supplies. The station guard nodded toward the sealed junction. I can hold the flow here and redirect. Then came another voice, then another. A teenage apprentice with filters still under one arm. The customs clerk with tired eyes. The line cook from the night galley with a tray of untouched bread rolls now covered in clean towels to keep them warm. Ethan looked at them for one suspended heartbeat, and Lyra saw it clearly. Then. Compassion was not soft. It was load-bearing. All right, Ethan said, already assigning tasks. You take blankets. You take anyone who cannot move fast. Keep pairs together. Nobody goes alone. The corridor shifted again, no longer a waiting crowd but a network waking up. Someone comforted a crying child while someone else gave up a seat on an overturned supply bin. A woman who had barely enough gloves for herself tucked one onto the hand of a stranger. Near the back, two travelers who had been arguing minutes earlier now worked side by side to move a jammed cart out of the path. Lyra felt the station change around her, not because the danger had passed, but because the humans inside it had decided to become part of the solution before they were instructed to. Ethan started toward the bypass hatch with the first group, then stopped short and tilted his head. From somewhere deeper in the deck came a muffled metallic slam, followed by the hollow sound of a manual alarm being struck more than once. Not automatic. Someone was trapped in calling the old way. Ethan closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, already knowing what the sound meant. When he opened them again, he handed his tool case to Lyra. Lyra caught the tool case by instinct, the weight of it dragging slightly at her arm before she steadied it against her leg. Ethan had already turned toward the sound, head angled, listening past the frightened corridor and the pulse of emergency lights to that dull repeated clang somewhere deeper in the deck. It was not loud, but it had urgency in it, the human kind that came from someone conserving breath and hope at the same time. Take them through the freight bypass, he said, eyes already on the dark service junction ahead. Clinic waiting bay, Sector 12 East. It still has backup heat if the map was right. Lyra held the case tighter. And you? Ethan gave her a look she understood immediately and disliked on sight. It was not recklessness. It was worse. It was certainty. Somebody is still back there. Then I am coming with you. No, the answer came fast, but not harsh. He glanced toward the cluster of travelers gathering around the bypass hatch, toward the nurse and the cargo handler and the station guard waiting for direction. They had decided to trust from him. They need someone with authority, access, and a cooler head than mine is about to have. Another metallic strike echoed down the corridor, weaker this time. Ethan exhaled once. Lyra, move them. Then he was gone, running into the red-lit service passage with nothing but a utility lamp clipped to his belt and a station badge that opened doors older than half the people on board. For one impossible heartbeat, Lyra stood frozen between two futures. One was clean. She could obey the recall order still flashing on her wrist, route herself to protected shelter, and tell her superiors that a human maintenance medic had chosen an irrational personal risk. That report would fit easily into the language she had been trained to write. The other future was messier. It required responsibility. It required attachment. It required admitting that what Ethan had shown her was no anomaly but a standard he had already started to teach her. Behind her, a child began to cry again. The sound broke the paralysis. Lyra set Ethan's case on a supply bin, stepped into the center of the corridor, and raised her voice with more command in it than she had ever used outside a survey chamber. "Listen to me. We are moving now. Medical priority to the front. Children with the nurse. Those able to carry, assist those who cannot. No one separates." Heads turned. Bodies shifted. She activated her Valen credentials against the bypass hatch, overriding a sluggish lock cycle, and the heavy door rolled open with a groan of old seals. Warmed air drifted out from the sheltered corridor beyond, not much, but enough to make people believe movement had a destination. "Guard," she said, pointing to the broad-shouldered officer at the junction. "You hold the rear and keep the path clear." He nodded at once. "Cargo team, blankets and food to the center group. Apprentice, stay with the elderly couple. Do not let them fall behind." Even as she spoke, she felt the station answer with people. The line cook distributed covered rolls without being asked twice. The customs clerk took a frightened child onto her hip while the child's father lifted 2 bags and apologized to everyone in sight. The teenage apprentice who had nearly dropped his filters earlier now walked backward in front of an older traveler, describing every change in the floor grade so she would not stumble. Compassion moved faster than panic once somebody gave it a route. Lyra guided the first groups into the bypass, then paused at the threshold and looked back toward the dark service passage where Ethan had disappeared. Her recall signal flashed again, brighter and more insistent, joined now by a direct priority hail from Supervisor Talron. "Return immediately. Survey personnel are not to engage in civilian intervention." Lyra stared at the words until they blurred. Then, with deliberate calm, she muted the calm entirely. The station seemed louder without it, more honest. Far down the service junction, almost lost beneath the hum of emergency systems and the shuffle of evacuees, she heard a different sound at last, a door release cycling open, followed by Ethan's voice, low and steady, speaking to someone she could not yet see. Relief hit her so suddenly it felt like pain. She did not analyze that feeling. She simply turned back to the frightened travelers, lifted Ethan's tool case in one hand, and kept leading them forward as if she had been doing it all her life. By the time the last of the evacuees reached the clinic waiting bay, the worst of the panic had thinned into exhaustion. Backup heaters hummed along the walls with uneven determination, pushing out bands of dry warmth that smelled faintly of dust and old filters, and the room filled slowly with the ordinary sounds of survival settling in, tired children asking for water, med carts rolling over floor seams, blankets unfolding, voices lowering now that they no longer had to compete with fear. Lyra set Ethan's tool case beside a supply bench and turned just as he appeared in the doorway with a frail station archivist wrapped in an emergency thermal sheet and leaning heavily on one shoulder. The older man's silver hair was damp with sweat, his breathing shallow but steady, his access badge still hanging crooked from a chain at his neck as if he had tried to keep working right up until the doors sealed around him. Ethan guided him toward the nurse, answered 3 questions at once, then finally straightened with the slow stiffness of a man whose body had used up its last easy reserve half an hour ago. His hair was damp at the temples. There was grease on one sleeve, dust on both knees. And a shallow scrape across the back of one hand that he seemed not to notice. He looked around the room, counting without appearing to count, checking blankets, exits, heat vents, faces. Only when he confirmed that everyone had made it through did something in him loosen. Lyra saw it happen in real time, like a cable finally taking less strain. "You found him," she said. Ethan rubbed a hand over his face. "Archivist in subsector records. He got trapped when the manual shutters dropped. Said he heard the corridor and kept hitting the old alarm because he figured if the modern systems were failing, maybe the old ones still believed in noise." Lyra looked toward the nurse, who was already warming the man's hands between her own before checking his vitals. "And did they?" Ethan glanced at the room full of shared blankets, passed cups, borrowed patients, and strangers leaning closer to one another than procedure required. "Seems like they did." For a moment neither of them spoke. The emergency lights had finally shifted from red to amber, and in that softer glow the clinic bay looked less like a shelter and more like a promise the station had barely managed to keep. Lyra's wrist comm, muted for the better part of an hour, lit again with a queued transmission request from the survey suite. She lifted her arm, looked at the flashing identifier for Supervisor Talron, and this time she answered. His holographic image resolved above the comm, crisp and composed as ever, though even he could not hide the strain around his eyes. "Dr. Vane," he said, "your report is overdue." Lyra held his gaze. "Yes. I will require a concise assessment. Has your field observation altered the preliminary conclusion regarding human emotional stability?" Around her, a customs clerk tucked a blanket around a sleeping child not her own. The line cook split the last of the bread rolls into smaller pieces so more people could have some. The cargo handler who had volunteered earlier now sat on the floor beside an elderly traveler, holding a cup steady while she drank. Ethan had moved to the far heater without being asked and was adjusting its angle so the warmth reached the coldest corner of the room first. No applause. No speeches. Just the hidden infrastructure, working. Lyra drew one slow breath. "Yes," she said. "Completely." Talron's expression did not change, but his silence sharpened. Lyra continued before he could interrupt. "We came to evaluate whether humans were too emotionally volatile for deeper cultural access. That was the wrong metric. Humans are volatile, yes. They are inconsistent, impulsive, and frequently inefficient by our standards. But they are also the only species I have studied in which compassion appears not as ceremonial virtue or selective obligation, but as a distributed reflex. It crosses rank, profession, biology, and circumstance. Under strain, they do not merely protect themselves. They keep choosing one another. Repeatedly. At cost." She looked across the room to Ethan, who had finished adjusting the heater and was now sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, eyes closed for just a second, one hand still resting on the shell and copper travel charm in his pocket as if gratitude had weight. "If you wish to understand humanity," Lyra said softly, "do not begin with their wars. Begin with what they carry for strangers when nobody requires it. That is the part of them strong enough to trust." Talron said nothing for several seconds. Then the transmission cut cleanly, not in dismissal but in thought. The clinic bay settled deeper into amber quiet. Ethan opened his eyes and found Lyra still standing there with the comm lowered in one hand. "How bad was it?" he asked. Lyra crossed the room, picked up his overshirt from where someone had folded it on the bench, and placed it gently over his shoulders before answering. "For your species," she said. "Very good." Ethan looked at her, tired enough that the smile he gave her had no defense left in it. Outside the clinic windows, Earth turned in silence beneath the station, blue and white and impossibly alive against the dark. Inside, warm air moved through patched vents, children slept under borrowed blankets, and strangers rested because other strangers had refused to look away. Lyra took the seat beside him and listened to the station breathe. For the first time since arriving,